Hispanic, Latino, Latinx. You hear these labels used to identify over 43% of Harris County's population. But do you know the difference between these terms and what each one means? We're exploring this topic with Magdalena Mayeri, Director of Latino History and Culture at the National Museum of American History Smithsonian Institution, Dr. Laura Murillo, President and CEO of the Houston Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Andy Canales, Executive Director of Latinos for Education, and Raul Orlando Edwards, a creative visionary and founder of Flomart and Strictly Street Salsa. I'm Deborah Duncan, host of KHOU's Great Day Houston, and these are Cultural Conversations. All right, so what's in a name? There's a lot. Sometimes we have a name change for political reasons, sometimes economic reasons, sometimes culturally sensitive reasons. So when we say Hispanic, that is a big umbrella that so many people don't understand. In fact, they think it's a race that has kind of one look. When I was in Venezuela several years ago, people kept stopping me. They go, Negrita Cubana? Negrita Jamaicana? Negrita Dominica? And I go, no, Negrita Americana. And they go, oh. And so I realized then, wait, Hispanic can look like anything. It's white with red hair and blue eyes. It's brown skin, Asians, blacks. And so I want to start, Magdalena, with you by clarifying Hispanic is not a race.
Thank you for starting that way, Deborah. Exactly. Race is a social construct. Hispanic, Latino is an ethnicity, and the terms are used interchangeably, but there are historical roots. Generally speaking, Hispanics trace their roots to Spain, and it's mostly Spanish-speaking countries, while Latino is more inclusive of Latin American countries, and language is not perhaps the dominant factor as it is in Hispanic. Now we also have the term Latinx. Only 3% of the Latino population identifies as Latinx.
In 2019, the U.S. Hispanic population reached 60.6 million, up from 50.7 million in 2010. Texas has 3 of the top 10 cities in the U.S. when it comes to the largest Hispanic population: Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. The 3 largest Latino ethnic groups in the U.S. are Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Cuban. In Houston, the largest groups are Mexican, Salvadoran, and Honduran. It's interesting when you look at, the Caribbean, Central South America. So you had your Native Americans already there. You had the slave trade come through. You had the conquistadors come through. And so you have this kind of beautiful melting pot, I think. And Raul, you're part of that beautiful melting pot. When you speak, you confuse people.
I think one of the things that I discovered when I moved to the United States, especially in the South, it was the element of people not encountering people that look like me that spoke Spanish. So there's so many anecdotes that I have about people looking at me and wondering, why do you speak Spanish? Or where did you learn to speak Spanish that well? And I will say, well, it's really my first language. That was usually a shock, like, oh, well, I guess the stereotype of expecting me to look and or sound in a specific way is something that was really captivating to people, but also it gave me the opportunity to educate on the subject. So, as you said, there's been so many instances where people have had that reaction, and so I just see that opportunity to share about the culture. Understanding the culture empowers you to know where you're going. And like in my case, I'm half Panamanian, half Jamaican. But in that context, I do have African, obviously by the my skin color and my physical traits. But I also have European and also have indigenous. So as I embrace all 3, and I'm proud of all 3 because all 3 make me up, then as I move forward, I know how to navigate, and it empowers me to reach the goals that I would like to achieve. So
you make a great point. When you go to school and enroll your child in class, there used to be, they would say, write down the race of your child, and it was like, black, white. That was about it at one point. But then when you look at it today, it has this whole subset. And so when you look at Hispanic, they do represent that umbrella. Why is it important to break it down that way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm really glad that there are more options for people to identify with their identity, because we Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx have as many things in common as we have differences. Every Latin American country is very distinct. The culture, there are similarities, but there are also differences. So it's really important that we provide as much flexibility as possible within these terms that are very imperfect.
Dr. Medillo, when I first moved from Taipei, Taiwan to San Antonio, I had a whole new group of friends, but I found it really interesting that when I would go to their house and the kids would speak Spanish to their parents, they said, no, don't speak Spanish, don't speak Spanish. Today, we celebrate being bilingual. We've come a long way, I think, in how we used to view what Hispanic is. And now there's a proudness to the culture and an acceptance, even among Hispanics.
I grew up speaking Spanish. Both of my parents spoke Spanish to me, and I made a commitment then that if I ever had children, I wanted to make sure they could speak it and write it. Fast forward, my daughters are now 18 and 21 at Georgetown and Columbia University, and both have said, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you for making sure that when we didn't want to do the flashcards and didn't want to speak the language, you insisted on it." It is a gift that we give not only to our children, but to the world. We understand the value of second, third, fourth language. And shame on us if we do not embrace our culture while at the same time embrace American culture. It's okay to do both, and smart people understand the value of that.
And as the great writer Jorge Luis Borges said, language is not just the words, it's culture. So I think this brings full circle to being the power of being bicultural and embracing being from several places, having different cultures, bringing this diversity into mainstream American as much as we can. But yes, it's really, generations have changed, and there's true pride now in speaking Spanish and speaking more languages even than just one more.
Annie, we remember that scene in the movie Selena, and I'm not quoting it directly, I don't think, but basically her father was saying that, you're not Hispanic enough, and at times you're not white enough. You have to be the perfect mix.
And we got to prove to the Mexicans how Mexican we are, and we got to prove to the Americans how American we are. We got to be more Mexican than the Mexicans and more American than the Americans, both at the same time. It's exhausting. Man, nobody knows how tough it is to be a Mexican-American.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many of us across the country that identify with that scene and with those words, because we are constantly code switching. We're constantly switching our train of thought and our communication between English and Spanish. For me growing up, I found it frustrating at times. I think now, as Dr. Murillo was sharing, I see it as a gift. And it's allowed me to attune my social emotional skills, put myself in others' shoes, and to try to be more empathetic. And I credit that to how I grew up with two different cultures, two different languages, and code switching between all of that.
Magdalena, when it comes to how people identify with the word Hispanic, you'll find that different generations look at it differently. And I would imagine if someone who came here from El Salvador or came here from Honduras may write something different down on a piece of paper than someone who's been here for years. For example, I have a friend named Ron who said, we're fifth generation Texan. We didn't cross the border crossed us. And so for him, it's just, I'm just American. Right. So we're seeing a difference when it comes to generations of how they identify.
Yes, there recent research from the KHOU Hispanic Center, for example, points that for recent immigrants, it doesn't matter whether it's Latina, Latino, or Hispanic, that they really identify more closely with the country of origin. So in my case, I'm from Argentina. I always say I grew up into a Latina identity. When I first moved here more than 20 years ago, my identity was Argentinian. And then you grow as you share more of the culture of the country, that you grow into your job and you're making the community.
Among Americans with Hispanic ancestry, those who identify as Hispanic drop off across generations. 97% of individuals who were born in another country identify as Hispanic. For second-generation Hispanics, those who identify as Hispanic only drops off 5 points to 92%. But for third-generation Hispanics, 77% identify as Hispanic, and for fourth-generation or higher, the percentage drops off dramatically. In fact, it's split down the middle, with 50% identifying as Hispanic and 50% who do not.
Andy, I can't tell you how many times a week I'll say to somebody, they go, oh, yes, she's Mexican. I go, she's Mexican from Dominica Republica. Or they go, well, yeah, right? Because everyone's from Mexico. Everyone's from Mexico. If you speak Spanish, everyone's from Mexico. And, to your point of where your parents came from, that's another thing, the difference between nationality and what culture or ethnicity or race you are.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. For me personally, I grew up in Los Angeles. My parents immigrated from El Salvador. People thought I was Mexican when I lived in LA. I then moved to Miami. People thought I was Cuban. I then actually lived in New York City. People thought I was Puerto Rican. Obviously now I live in Texas, and some people think I'm a fifth generation Mexican American. And so what that underscores for me is the role that social construct plays in how people perceive others and how we perceive ourselves. And then the second thing that I think it emphasizes is how important it is for us to be flexible and open to people identifying in lots of different ways, given how imperfect a lot of these labels and terms are. But I think if there's one highlight from this conversation today is that our culture is very rich, it's very diverse, and with that comes a lot of different ways that we can identify and navigate this beautiful identity.
Yeah, the differences between nationality, ethnicity, culture, race, the whole bit, but all of it's good. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.